I think within this realm of racial inequality, the plight of Black boys and Black men needs to be front and center. Community institutions matter a lot in life. And when government has limited reach into people's private lives, I think those community institutions can be very important as a source of support, as a method for affecting people's values and the behavior driven by those values. The three pillars of a successful policy, I think, have to be, number one, better education, especially in the K through 12 years. Number two, better employment and kind of the kinds of workforce programs that lead to better employment outcomes. And then number three, less crime and less incarceration. Those are the three buckets, three areas where I think we're getting better and better evidence on improving the quality of workforce development services for the people who need it the most, and especially, I would say, young men of color.
Hello, Harry Holzer. How are you?
I'm good, Glenn. It's nice to see you.
Good to see you too. This is indeed Glenn Loury, and if you're watching, you've found the Glenn Show. And my guest today is the economist whom I've known for a long time. And I think I first met you when you were a graduate student at Harvard. I believe you were working with Richard Freeman. Were you not?
That's right. It was over 40 years ago. It was in the early 1980s.
Yeah, it was in the 80s. Anyway, my guest is Harry Holzer, and he's a Lafarge professor of public policy at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. He's an economist. He has experience in government. He served during the Clinton administration as chief economist at the U.S. Department of Labor when Robert Reich was the secretary there, if I'm not mistaken.
I came a little bit after Reich, so the secretary whom I worked with was Alexis Herman.
I see. So this is Harry Holzer, and he's an old acquaintance of mine. I mean, you date me, Harry. I was new on the faculty at Harvard in the early 1980s.
I'm dating both of us.
So we're both geezers. I guess we've been around for a while. But Harry's a social policy guy, and I want to talk to him about in this election season and are we in past peak woke? Are we past Black Lives Matter in this kind of post-racial reconciliation season about the social policy questions, especially having to do with racial inequality? Harry and I happen to both, and we'll link to this, contribute to a virtual conference that the Boston Federal Reserve Bank of Boston sponsored on racial inequality, and he made a presentation there that very much impressed me. But are you a conservative Democrat, Harry?
I think of myself as being a moderate Democrat, still a bit left of center. On economic issues, I've probably moved a bit to the left, as many people have in the last decade. But on some social issues, race issues, I think I've moved what I would say to the center rather than the right. And I just think those issues are much more complicated than the usual, what I consider to be more one-sided stories coming from both the left and the right. I've tried to take pieces from each of them and talk about more complex developments and interactions and what they suggest for policy.
So, with respect to the issues of racial inequality, which are many, what would be some of the policy proposals or endeavors, policy initiatives that you think would be most important to talk about?
Well, before I get there, I want to say that I think within this realm of racial inequality, the plight of Black boys and Black men needs to be front and center. And of course, Glenn, when you and I interacted that over 40 years ago, and Richard Freeman and I were editing a volume on Black youth, in some sense, that was the beginning of a conversation. But so many things have evolved. And that's been an underdeveloped area, both of conversation and policy. For instance, when you look at Black girls and Black women, on some dimensions, they're doing quite well and their outcomes have improved. Certainly on employment, the numbers started getting much better in the 80s and 90s. If you look at upward mobility measures among, say, women or girls born into lower income families, Black girls in those families experience as much personal earnings and employment mobility and education mobility, as do white and Latino women. They're really doing reasonably well. It's when you turn to the men, the boys and the men, that the numbers look much worse, which then, of course, brings down household incomes in the Black community because then the marriage rates are so much lower. So I want to go back to a focus on Black boys and Black men. And of course, we can get to a more of a political discussion later. I find it interesting that it's really the men who seem to be abandoning traditional progressive politics, the Democrats in some ways. So we can come back to that. But to me, that's a second reason that we got to focus more clearly on the boys and the men. And when we focus on them, the three pillars of a successful policy, I think, have to be, number one, better education, especially in the K through 12 years. Number two, better employment and kind of the kinds of workforce programs that lead to better employment outcomes. And then number three, less crime and less incarceration. And I'd be happy to follow up in each of those three areas, talk about what I think the evidence shows about what would work, what kinds of things we want to try to scale up.
I think that's a good plan. Education, employment, and incarceration as the venues where you look for policy initiative focused on Black men. I want to ask some questions first. I mean, the big question I have is, are the women going to let the politics focus on men? I mean, there isn't there a gender tension down underneath the surface of this that about, I mean, the issue of abortion, for example, is so important in the political realm and in the Democrats' framework. And um, the Me Too is a recent memory. Can we focus on men just as a political reality? Are the women going to let you?
Well, so it's illegal to have policies only for men, right? So we can't do that. We can't say, oh, this is a training program and it's only going to be for men. We can do things in areas, and this was a lesson, one of many lessons I learned from the great William Julius Wilson, that you focus on policies in areas that you think will disproportionately serve the people who are most left behind. And I think we can do that if we focus on the right policies in these three areas. The political dimension is very interesting, I think. And about in the early 2000s, when I was writing a lot of this stuff with my late colleague, Paul Offner, and we talked about the need to have reforms in areas like child support to make it easier for Black non-custodial fathers to try to keep up with their required payments. And there were attacks on us for doing that from organizations like NOW, the National Organization of Women. It seemed to us in some ways that a lot of those attacks were coming from upper middle class, often white women who came from a certain ideological position and resented any kind of effort to help men. I felt less of that from African American women and the women who were active in these communities who understood the great difficulties faced by Black boys and Black men, and that if you can help them, you might improve marriage rates and you might improve child support rates. And ultimately, that would provide benefits to Black moms and their kids, the kids for whom they have custody. So I don't think there was a uniform opposition to that. But again, with the right caveats. We're not talking about discriminatory policy, but policies to help those who have been most left behind.
Now, you say Black men. Is the gender disparity in outcomes, the outcomes that we'd be concerned about, bigger amongst Blacks than it is amongst whites? Or are we observing a general phenomenon in the society along gender lines that just happens to have its most, deleterious expression in the low-income communities that might be disproportionately Black?
You are certainly correct that, for instance, in education, on almost every dimension of education, girls and women outperform boys and men. That's true for every racial group in the US and indeed in most societies in the world. So there is something generic about gender differences in education that we haven't fully figured out. And I think the gap between Black boys and Black girls is not dramatically larger than that gender gap is in other communities. It's probably a little larger because the dropout rate among Black boys remains fairly high, and you have problems of disciplinary actions for behavioral issues that then exacerbate those gaps. But when you look at employment, that's where the unique situation of Black men really becomes apparent. First of all, Latino men, especially the immigrants, work in very large numbers. Now, there's wage gaps, but their employment rates, their labor force activity is quite high compared to native-born whites and Blacks. When you look at Black men, not only are their employment outcomes worse relative to the other groups of men, if you calculate them the right way, in other words, there's a lot of Black men missing from those numbers because they're incarcerated or they don't show up in the household service. When you adjust for the missing Black men, their employment rates sometimes look worse than those of Black women. There's no other group for whom that's true. And similarly for incarceration. So on education, you might find similar gender gaps, but on employment and crime and incarceration, the gaps are uniquely large between Black women and Black men.
So I have a speculation that's uninformed, and I wonder if it makes any sense at all. And that is that the family responsibilities of the reproduction across generations of, kids fall on women disproportionately and are quickening in a person's life. You have a kid, you're responsible for the kid. You kind of don't do drugs as frequently. You don't not work as much because, you're responsible for the kid. And if there's anything that's different between racial groups in America, it is family structure and sort of social relations of reproduction. I could call it like that. And what that militates in favor of is less responsibility because of a high out of wedlock birth rates and low marriage rates and high single parenthood and a large proportion of children being raised by a mother alone. Relatively less pressure to, behave responsibly on men than women, which is disproportionate in the Black community for the reasons that I've cited, and which reflects itself in the kind of statistics on education and employment that you're calling attention to. Does that make any sense?
I think it does. I might use slightly different descriptors for that situation. By the way, there's a wonderful book by an economist named Melissa Kearney at the University of Maryland on this very topic. And of course, she and other people emphasize that you look at the working class of any racial group, the incidence of single parenthood is really rising quite dramatically. But it remains highest in the Black community, as you point out. And there have been other scholars looking at how exactly that comes to pass. I think Ron Mincy has done great work on this. Catherine Eden has done great works on this as well. And when I think about what's going on there, to me, I think you're right. There is a failure to accept responsibility, but it's part of a more complex set of circumstances, I think, that have evolved over time, in which a lot of these young men, again, if they've dropped out of school, maybe they've dropped out of the workforce, I think the opportunities they face, partly because of society, partly maybe their own choices, really limits their ability to be good providers. So it's a complex set. The people who say it's all structural barriers and bias, it's some of that. The people who say it's lack of personal responsibility, there's some of that. I think those things interact and reinforce each other. And especially Catherine Eden's work on this kind of talks about how when the mom becomes pregnant, first bears the child, there is a sincere desire on the part of Black men to be a good parent, not necessarily married, but to pay child support and try to do the right thing, and how over time that just doesn't persist in many cases, that those good intentions, when they come up at the reality of unstable work experience in the labor market, maybe substance problems, maybe a criminal record of some kind, that their good intentions don't last over time, and the tension rises between the parents, and the black men fall away, and then might do that whole same cycle with a second or third mom. This phenomenon of what people call complex families, where the dad might be a non-custodial dad in multiple families and have gone through similar cycles. So I think some of what you said is true, but I think the context is difficult and challenging, and it's within that context that we have to. And it's very hard to change this behavior through policy. I think Ron Mincy has taught us that we can do some things on child support to help the dads be more supportive. But Isabel Sawhill, an outstanding scholar at Brookings, has written about this, and she says, contraception is where you can have some real policy effects, but changing marriage rates, we just don't have good evidence on how to do that.
Now, the subtext that I hear in your most recent remarks is, I hope that the subtext is, don't blame the victim. Don't be judgmental. Understand that, yeah, people have responsibilities, but there's also forces that are acting on them, and it's a multidimensional problem. And when you put the racial on it, it's like blacks are higher, blacks are less, whatever. And then it's like you're saying something about black culture, and that's an overly simplistic way of thinking about it. Am I onto something there?
I'm trying, first of all, to distance myself from simplistic, one-sided points of view, as I said, both on the left and the right, both which don't help me that much. Each of them has a piece of truth. I do think the reality is more complicated. I would never use an expression like blame the victim, because I think even victimhood, and Glenn, I remember years ago when you used an expression called comparative victimology, when groups are arguing with each other about who's. I think getting into a whole conversation about victims, I don't say that. I want people to take more responsibility, and I do think, and I've written my friend Michael Strain at the American Enterprise Institute, and we were together on a panel of the National Academy of Sciences, which came up with a lot of good policy prescriptions to improve opportunity. But at the same time, we also embraced Melissa Kearney's book, and we say this has to be about opportunity and responsibility. And in fact, when people behave responsibly, they end up getting more opportunity, right? And on all of these different dimensions, they have to not drop out of school. They have to not drop out of the labor force. They should use good contraception. And if they bear a child, they need to take responsibility. So I don't want to use this, I'm not going to blame the victim frame. But I just want a framing that acknowledges both responsibility and other challenges. And it's not either or. That's the problem with the left and the right. They both want to make it one or the other instead of a complex world where both matter. But responsibility is very important.
You have mentioned child support a couple of times here. You said in the context of worrying about, I don't know, disincentives to work for Black men who are on the end of a child support order. But you've also said it about Ron Mincy finding that there were some things to be done in the child support system that might be interesting policy initiative. You want to talk a little bit more about that? I mean,
sure.
Because it's a big thing, is it not? I mean, it's kind of beneath the surface of the social policy popular discussion, but it's not a trivial matter.
No, it's not. And here again, the efforts we've tried, like there's a set of employment programs that HHS piloted during the Obama years. They went under the title of C-SPED, which it was a package of kind of employment and training programs, and the impacts were disappointing, as these things often turn out to be. But I think there is this issue of what we call arrears, where men fall behind, fall into debt relative to their child support obligations. And it turns out there's two kinds of arrears. There's arrears to the mom and her kids versus arrears to the state, because some states, take it out against men if their families then have to go on public assistance. A number of states have made efforts to help men manage their arrears. There has been some arrear forgiveness if you're doing the right thing today. I don't know if the research evidence suggests that that kind of thing is very effective. I haven't seen that much. Maybe the evidence exists, but it's that kind of thing, helping. And here a more conservative scholar, Larry Mead at NYU, has often talked about what he called help and hassle. What you want to hassle these guys and pressure them to take their obligations seriously, but then you want to help them do so if, in fact, they show some interest or some willingness to do that. And like Larry favors more mandatory pressure on dads to pay their arrears. On the other hand, some states do things like if you suspend somebody's driver's license, just going to make it harder for them to get to their jobs, right? So it's going to make them hard to earn the money that they need. So in this whole area of arrears management and helping non-custodial dads, low-income non-custodial dads meet their obligations, there's certainly room for things to be tried. And I believe some states have been trying to do things like that.
As a general matter, because the child support governance problem seems to raise this question. How do you're the state, you want to control behavior. It could be law enforcement, it could be family behavior, whatever. You got taxes, you can put fines on people. You got prison, you can confine them, you can deprive them of their liberty. I mean, there's not, it's a pretty crude toolbox of instruments that are available to you relative to voluntary social organization like a church. I'm not advocating anything here. I'm just making the observation that when it's a voluntary thing that people are submitting themselves to, the refinement of the governing architecture takes place. I mean, you can tell them it's wrong. You can withhold social approval from them, which is a more subtle instrument than confining them or taking away their money. And there ought to be a place, shouldn't there, for that kind of appeal, a moral appeal, not as a state-sponsored doctrine, but as a voluntarily entered into social community. And is there any place within the policy discourse for A, acknowledging what I just got through saying, if you think it's correct, and B, for promoting that kind of activity through the instruments that are available to public policymakers?
Well, that's a great question, Glenn. And so you are right that on this particular issue, the instruments in our toolkit are crude and sometimes lead to counterproductive outcomes. Like I said, suspending people's driver license or putting them in jail does not enhance their ability to earn money, which that could then be used for child support. And, you mentioned churches, and in that volume over 40 years ago that you and I both wrote chapters for, my mentor, Richard Freeman, had a paper where he simply looked at variables that correlate with good or bad education and employment outcomes among young blacks. And by far the strongest correlation was people who attend church do better. Now, that didn't prove that it was church per se causing that, right? That correlates with lots of other attitudes. But it was really quite striking how big that correlation was. And there's a whole literature now on community institutions matter a lot in life. And when government has limited reach into people's private lives, I think those community institutions can be very important as a source of support, as a method for affecting people's values and the behavior driven by those values. So, and I would agree with people that certainly the government should stop, this view that I often find among my students that no one has the right to say anything about family structure because it's simply a lifestyle choice. And I tell my students, well, if it hurts the kids in those families, it's not just a neutral lifestyle choice. I think it's okay for people to start sending the message that people have to take responsibility and do more. And the church is one of the institutions that can enhance that message. Are there policies to? I'm not sure. I know my friend Michael Strain argues very strongly that messaging matters And at a minimum, government should start re-embracing that message and supporting other institutions where that message can come through. Hard to actively support, but at least in messaging. So, yes, I think that institution can play an important role.
Okay, let's go back to your. You had a three-part policy framework: education, employment, and prison. You're worried about Black men. We've discussed: is it possible to worry effectively about Black men given the politics of gender? Uh, and some general talk about racial inequality. But what about education and Black boys and men on a policy point of view? Do you think is worth talking about?
I do, and again, low-income kids and African American kids fall behind very quickly. By the time they show up in kindergarten, they're usually behind. Um, there are pre-K programs, some of which are very good, some have been less successful. I think actually the evidence on what you can do in the K through 12 years is better than I had thought it was. And again, you wouldn't target specifically, but if you do it, more of it in lower income communities with a lot of African Americans, I think boys will be helped the most. Things like, well, first of all, resources matter in these school systems. You know, the old argument by my friend Rick Hanushek that money doesn't matter. I think that's been disproven. Money does matter, and just allowing there to be more resources for these predominantly low-income communities matters. But there's some
I
specific
want you to come back to that, but go ahead and
okay. There's some specific things that really do work. For instance, when Black boys have more Black male teachers, they do better. There's surprisingly good evidence on that. Just changes their whole relationship to authority figures in the classroom. There
you
are
know, I'd heard that said, but I did not know there was good evidence to that
there
effect,
is
and
good evidence.
that's very interesting.
Yeah. A second thing, things like high dosage tutoring, really putting a lot of resources into helping these boys and girls who are falling behind to keep them. That seems to be effective. And my favorite is what I would call high quality career and technical education. You know, we used to have this view voc ed is a disaster. It tracks people of color and working class kids. There was some truth to that. But we've developed some really nice examples of high quality career and tech ed, you know, starting mostly in the high school years, career academies, and now some of these pathway programs from high school into community college like P-Tech. The evidence on those is quite strong. We want to get away from a view where every kid has to get a degree, whether it's a 2-year or 4-year degree, but to help kids find something in the post-secondary education world that works for them and can enhance their connections to the labor market. So I think if you put all those things together, you know, matching by race and gender, high dosage tutoring to help people from falling behind, and then good career and tech ed options. And by the way, career academies can be quite strong on academics, and it doesn't necessarily close any doors. But then you widen the range of options. So I think that's where I would put my resources if I had to choose.
That's interesting. Do you know Robert Cherry, the economist?
I do.
Because he's been talking about this voc ed thing for a long time.
That's right. And again,
Not the only one, but yeah.
no, but you know, and if you focus on what we used to call voc ed, it was pretty lousy. And it did track kids away and it did give them no high quality alternatives. What we're talking about here is a range of high quality options. And then you help people choose the option that's best for them. And it doesn't close the doors. And some of them are pathways into community college. Maybe starts with a certificate program, but then the certificates can be stacked towards a degree.
Stackable certificates. That's what he talks about. And
That's right.
Roland Fryer and his work in Houston on education reform has found that tutoring is an important part of the package of changes that he thinks he's found evidence that they are materially beneficial for learning outcomes.
Roland is right. There is some quite strong evidence on what people call high dosage tutoring that really generates some nice, you know, and again, for the people who are continually falling more and more behind, that can prevent some of that.
Okay, now what about the school choice charter school battle? Is that factor at all into your view of the policy terrain in education?
It does. I find myself less sympathetic on complete private vouchers, where I just think the evidence is much more mixed. But and the evidence is mixed on charter schools as well. But there's enough evidence of high quality outcomes in the charter school space that I think we want to preserve those and promote those. And I don't join my progressive friends who want to shut all that stuff down, because there are some good success stories in the charter school world.
Is there any sense that the high dosage tutoring and vocationally oriented high quality programming are impeded or facilitated by in the public school framework by teachers unions and stuff like that?
Well, my casual evidence suggests that, well, the teacher unions clearly don't like charter schools, and clearly don't like having choice within the public school framework. I think that's unfortunate because, again, we want to promote a whole range of high quality outcomes and then help people choose within them. And even here, there's some evidence. Like there was evidence a number of years ago, a high school program in New York City called Small Schools of Choice, where you took big factory type high schools and broke them down into schools, each of which had a theme. And then you help people choose the theme that makes the most sense for them. And the outcomes were quite good. So I just don't support when the teachers unions want to shut all that down. I think that's unfortunate. Now, when it comes to high quality career and tech ed, it's not as clear to me that the teachers unions are an impediment.
Now, this is an argument for flexibility and choice in the institutional framework of public education that I've not heard, which is I can summarize it if I get it right. If I get it wrong, you should tell me. People are different, families are different, their circumstances vary. If we want effective programming to help people, it has to be flexible enough to allow us to accommodate those differences. We don't know what type of person we're dealing with necessarily, but they do. Therefore, their exercise of discretion on behalf of their particular situation is an important part of solving the problem of matching the resources provided to the particular needs of the families in question. In the educational context, that can mean varying institutional frameworks for providing education. For example, a choice among programs that are focused on promoting vocational outcomes. When we have a ossified, I know that's a judgmental word, bureaucracy of self-interested employment that is, views every kind of institutional challenge as a threat, we impede the ability to be flexible enough in our provision of public services to take advantage of the informational asymmetry. This will be economics talk, but you see what I'm saying, that is in play here. Something like that. That's an argument for choice. That's not an anti-public school union as much as it is a recognition that you want flexibility and different kinds of secondary and primary and secondary educational provision so that families can match up with what best suits their needs.
I think that's exactly right. You're right that one size doesn't fit all. So we've had these successful models, the Harlem Children's Zone by Jeff Canada, which is a charter school model. The KIPP academies, there's some very strong evidence on KIPP, but those aren't right for every single family or for every single kid. Again, what you want to have is a range of high quality options. And another very interesting story is that after Katrina in New Orleans, the school system was completely rebuilt around choice and quite successfully. And the outcomes for the kids really improved. Now, there's a Tulane professor, former student of mine named Doug Harris, who wrote a whole book on this. And he argues, he says, yes, the outcomes were better. That doesn't necessarily mean you could do this in every location. And he identifies a set of unique circumstances which came together to lead to successful outcomes in that particular case. But it shows, I think your general point is correct, that one size doesn't fit all, different families in different locations, different state policy environments, means you have to have a range of high quality options and help people make the choice. And again, one of the many reasons that I am not a big fan of completely voucherized system that includes a lot of private schools is that higher income people have the resources to supplement the public resources to sort of to use up all the best slots in a lot of those systems. So I prefer a charter model, but you have to help the parents get them the right information, the right counseling, and help them make good choices. And then supports that make it easier to get their kids. If when you get out of the neighborhood school and you're looking at a citywide, district-wide set of choices, it's harder in terms of transportation and things like that. So you need a set of supports to help parents make good choices out of a range of high quality options, I think.
Okay, that was education. What about employment?
Um, on employment, I think that we're starting to have some really nice evidence on what works short of a 4-year bachelor's degree, or even short in some cases of a 2-year associate degree. And here there's 3 buckets. First of all, work-based learning. Students like when students are going to get trained, they like it when it's a part of a job because they like getting paid while they're training, and it makes it much more likely that they're going to stick with it and succeed. Now, the best known model there is apprenticeship. My friend Bob Lerman at the Urban Institute has been a decades long advocate of how to expand. And the key puzzle there is we have all this evidence saying apprenticeship is good for the trainees and good for employers, which then begs the question, well, if it's so great, why don't we see more of it? And, I think employers perceive it maybe as being too costly, too heavily regulated. Maybe they're right about some of those perceptions. Maybe they exaggerate some of them. But in that realm, even outside of apprenticeship, work-based learning is very important, and a range of work-based learning options that we want to scale. Secondly, in the community colleges, there are workforce programs, certificate programs that are pretty clearly not very academic, sometimes for credit, sometimes not for credit. How do we improve the quality of those and improve the financing? There's a lot of good innovation being done in that area. And then there are these things we call sectoral programs, often standalone, Perscolis, Jewish Vocational Services, the Wisconsin Regional Training Partnership, that work with industry associations in high demand sectors that provide good paying jobs for non college graduates, healthcare, IT, advanced manufacturing, transportation and logistics. And these, they work hand in hand with the industries to train people to have the skills that people need in those sectors. So we have some fantastic programs in that space. They're the challenges. How do you scale them up and make them more effective? But sort of those are the 3 buckets, 3 areas where I think we're getting better and better evidence on improving the quality of workforce development services for the people who need it the most. And especially, I would say, you know, young men of color.
Forgive my ignorance. I don't really even know what apprenticeship is. How would that work as a practical matter? What?
Apprenticeship is usually a contract of some length of time. It could be a
Aha.
year, it could be 2 or 3 years, where an employer agrees to take someone on, to pay them for work on the job, but also to train them. The wages are often below the starting market wage, right? We know from economics that's what enables employers to put more money in those situations. In Europe, they're very popular and very strong. Of course, Europe does more tracking in a lot of countries, but we have our own versions of apprenticeships, again, sort of longer term contracts between employers and trainees, where on the job people can train and get paid for doing so, and then emerge with a credential, a certificate of some kind, an industry recognized credential. Some of the better apprenticeships might also help pay for someone to go to community college and get a certificate while they're also working on their apprenticeship. The evidence we have is pretty good on the success of these models, but we
Okay, so
need to improve the take up.
we're both economists. I'm going to ask the Chicago question, which is, if this is so good, why isn't the market willing to? It's just a contractual form. Employers are always free to offer workers a longer term commitment as a condition of employment. Why do we need the government to promote through policy something which is available to employers and workers as one form in which they might conduct their economic relations? Where's the market failure here that the public supply or promotion of apprenticeship is a response to?
I think so. So it's a very good question, and I've wrestled with that question myself. I think I think there are a range of market failures. First of all, there's something that, Becker and Minster pointed out decades ago, that employers just don't want to invest very heavily if they think the people aren't going to stick around. They think they're going to move to a different employer, or if they perceive them as being not very good. And one of the downsides of being in a society where so many more young people have gone on to college, that employers are now more skeptical of the non-college pool. It's like more of the lower tail of the skill distribution. They also worry a lot about substance abuse and whether these young people will even stick around for the duration of the training. So some of that is market failure. Some of that is accurate and reasonable concerns. But I think it does mean that, and employers may not have the knowledge and the information about how to set up the apprenticeships. They may not have the liquid resources to finance it up front. It is a bit of a public good problem. And interestingly, the unions used to run a lot of these apprenticeship programs in construction. They still run them in construction, manufacturing. And the union meant that individual employers didn't have to worry about it. And, and there's a coordination failure. If there's a coordinated public response that the unions used to do, but to take the burden off of each company to deal with the fixed costs of doing it on their own. The unions have so disappeared from the private sector that they're not around to play that role anymore. So I think there are a range of difficulties of market failures that justify a public response. Now, it's very interesting. If you look at the 50 states, they all want to increase apprenticeship. They've taken very different approaches to doing so. Some states pay a tax credit to each employer, like $1,000 per new apprentice. Some places try to build it into the high schools. Colorado has a program, I think they call it youth, a notable youth apprenticeship program. So the states are doing a lot of things different, and it will be great to bring some evaluation evidence which states are doing this most successfully. But I think there are things there that merit a public response.
Now, somebody out there is going to notice, here we are talking about boys and black boys and men, and we're talking about employment. And we haven't used the word discrimination or anti-discrimination or anti-racism or diversity, equity, and inclusion a single time. Do you see any role for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission or the Fair Employment Commission of the state of Massachusetts or Rhode Island, or such activities, or of the more sort of informal diversity, equity, and inclusion movement within private sector to assist in your goal of enhancing outcomes for Black boys and men?
I think the quick answer is yes. So there is discrimination out there, and the evidence of it in these audit studies is reasonably strong. Of course, a lot of the discrimination is what you and I might call statistical discrimination, when an employer doesn't have enough information on exactly the skills they're looking for, so they use averages when they don't have enough information.
Racial averages.
That's right. Which, so I think one of the things you can do in some of these circumstances to fight discrimination is not just lawsuits, but actually providing good information. And I think an interesting realm of all of this, it gets to my third pillar of people, mostly men with criminal records, who have terrible, terrible employment outcomes in the labor market. That they bring a lot of problems with them: low skills, very little work experience, et cetera. But employers really don't want to hire them, especially black men with criminal records. Employers are very fearful of that. Well, it turns out that it's illegal for an employer to say, I'm not going to hire anyone with a criminal record, because it creates a disparate impact on black men. So the EEOC has actually done some very good work on, and very interestingly, one of the first set of guidances on how employers should do this and to not be discriminatory came from Clarence Thomas, who I know is an acquaintance of yours, a friend of yours, when he was the head of the EEOC before he was promoted to the Supreme Court. And he came up with some very sensible stuff, saying, if you do it in this circumstance, it's discrimination. If you do it in this circumstance, it's a reasonable qualification for work on the employer's part. So the EEOC has developed these guidances and has actually sued some big companies on this, and I think that's a fruitful area. But what you also find is that, for instance, there's a set of things like some people call them certificates of rehabilitation. If an offender completes a training program successfully or a work release stint, you give them a certificate indicating that they've done that. And then that ex-offender goes to apply for a job. If he or she can provide that evidence, it fights against the statistical discrimination that employers, this terrible fear that employers have of black men with criminal records. There's some evidence that it's a low-cost remedy that can really work.
This will amuse you. I have a theoretical paper with my former student, Young Chul Kim, it's published in the Journal of Public Economic Theory, and it's called Rebranding Ex-Cons. And what it does is make use of the fact that there's a selection effect. If you have a certificate that's costly in terms of time and effort to maintain, the guys that have the most interest in paying that cost to get certified are disproportionately going to come from the part of the ex-offending population that is less committed to going back to crime. And therefore, the employer is right to use the certificate as an indicator of a good bet amongst the ex-offending population, this kind of thing. That's a side point. I want to ask you this question.
But that's consistent with the evidence that there's some effect, right? So it's always good when our evidence is backed up with good theory.
And it's even better when theory is backed up with the evidence.
It's great when those two come together. It's great.
No, what I wanted to ask you was ban the box. So you said on the one hand, stereotyping. So you know, there's an adverse racial effect if employers don't have good idiosyncratic information because then they'll use the racial average. On the other hand, you said discriminate against people who are ex-offenders is bad because of disparate impact on blacks. And to which ban the box could be a response. The ban the box is the policy which makes it not appropriate for employers to ask the question in the first place about whether or not a worker has a criminal record, or a prospective worker has a criminal record. But that forces the employer to rely on non-idiosyncratic information in order to make a judgment about the fitness of the employee. So it seems like those things are inconsistent with one another.
Yeah,
liking stereotypes and banning the box are like in conflict with one another.
That's right. But the evidence I've seen, and there's mixed evidence on this, but I just think ban the box seems to make it worse in the sense that if you deny employers the information they're seeking, they'll just avoid the whole population. So ban the box, it might improve the prospects of these men, say black men that actually have their criminal records, makes it a little harder. But it's quite bad for black men, say with gaps in their work history, who don't have a criminal record. Now, employers can do criminal background checks for a small amount of money on the internet. There's a lot of error. There's a lot of quality control problems there. But yeah, I fear that, black box, denying employers the information they want can exacerbate problems, just make employers walk away from the whole population. I think you want to allow employers to do that, but then have conditions in place that will incentivize them to make better choices and more discerning choices about who's trustworthy. And of course, the other thing there is when you have a tight labor market, is your friend in this case, because what employers found out during the couple of years when we had the Great Resignation and you had labor shortages in all kinds of sectors and employers were desperate, they couldn't indulge their stereotypes anymore. So when they don't have access to their favored groups, then they're forced to make do and to try. And there's a long history of, we know about World War II, when a lot of white men went off to fight wars, a lot of black men were able to move into those jobs, especially in heavy industry. They performed fine, and that permanently reduced the amount of discrimination against those folks. I think similarly, tight labor markets, baby boomers retiring, can create conditions where employers are more open to trying someone else. And again, especially if you help them do that. The federal government has a bonding tool where if an employer is worried about theft or something like that, the bonding tool can help insure the employers against bad outcomes. The take-up is very, very low on those bonds. That could be another tool in the toolkit besides certificates of rehab and work release and things like that.
That's ironic. The federal government is prepared to indulge the employer stereotype. I want you to hire this ex-offender or this black worker whom you think might be disproportionately more likely to pilfer your stocks, and therefore you're unwilling to hire him. I tell you what,
Well,
I'll cover your losses, which buys into the stereotype.
no, that's right. It does. But again, if you know that's something the employers are nervous about, and there's a whole branch of criminology that estimates, what they call these hazard functions for the probability of recommitting a crime and a probability of recidivism for someone coming out. With the idea, of course, the longer they desist, after the first few years, their probabilities of committing these crimes are no worse than anyone else. And in the first year or two, the probabilities might be higher. So it might be a legitimate tool to provide these employers.
Okay, I have to ask the $64 question here. We're worried about employment. We're talking about low-skilled minority populations, black men. We've covered the ground in terms of stigma of criminal incarceration history. What about immigration? You say if the labor market is tight, it's good for them. If it's not, not so much. Well, what about immigration? That makes the labor market less tight than it otherwise would have been, doesn't it?
It does. It does. And how do I want to say immigration? I think so. There is a body of evidence on do immigrants displace native-born workers. The two big players in that field, two very good labor economists, have been David Card and George Borjas, where George has argued that there is some evidence of displacement. Card has argued against it. I think I come out somewhere in between. I think highly skilled immigrants, highly educated immigrants do enormous good for an economy, and they don't hurt these populations. Less educated immigrants, I think, can substitute for some of the native-born folks that we've been talking about and that we worry about. But I also think right now, so I have been in favor of immigration policies that put less emphasis on family unification for allowing immigrants to come in and put more emphasis on skills and what do they do in the job market. But I would always also say that we're in a world now, again, with the boomers retiring and with low native-born birth rates, the growth of the labor force has been pretty stagnant. If you look only at the native-born population, you don't want to have a stagnant economy. We don't want to have a stagnant labor force. The immigrants can play a positive role if we want a growing economy there. And also in a world where our generation, the baby boomers, are retiring, the needs for people to do elder care and that kind of health care has grown. You also need immigrants, I think, for that kind of work where native-born people are often reluctant to do it. So the immigration story, I think it's more complicated than usual. What I would like to see is a set of immigration reforms more tilted towards what they do for us in the job market, and a little less based simply on family unification. I think there's a good case to make that immigrants can often help us in the labor market, but that's what the focus should be. Maybe even having expanding visas for immigrants that are tied to working in specific sectors where you do have big needs like elder care and things like that. So if you do immigration the right way, I think you can get the benefits with fewer of the costs.
That's interesting. Do we have too many people in prison? We were talking about incarceration and black men.
I think so. Now, those numbers have come down.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the advocates talk about people in prison for one nonviolent felony drug conviction. There's a lot less of that than there was 5 or 10 years ago. I think we have brought down those numbers. We haven't completely eliminated those problems. But, violent crime is actually a terrible thing for these low-income communities of color. And an old friend of mine, Pat Sharkey, who's a sociologist at Princeton, has written about this very convincingly. The trauma you impose on children exposed to violent crime is terrible. We have to combat violent crime. And I really part company with, again, the progressives, for instance, who are very anti-police. Turns out there's good evidence. Just putting more cops on the street reduces homicides, especially in Black communities. You want them to do the right thing, of course, and not be abusive. But you want to keep reducing crime effectively. But you don't want to have more incarceration because it's so scarring for the people. And it turns out that juvenile detention even for small periods of time, can really scar these guys, force them to drop out of high school, drop out of the labor market. The social costs are much greater than the benefits you get.
Because of their exposure to violence in the detention context?
Partly that. Their social networks atrophy. And I know you've written a lot on social networks and their importance in upward mobility. But just the fact that they're much more likely to drop out of school as a result of this. So there are sometimes more effective alternatives, things like confinement with the use of electronic monitoring, for not terribly violent offenses, for sort of social disorder. Put an ankle bracelet on someone and say you can go to school, you can stay home, you can't leave your neighborhood or community. That there's at least some evidence that could work better and not have the scarring effects that incarceration has. So that's what I'm interested in. Deter crime, incapacitate people committing crimes with less of the collateral damage that high incarceration rates have caused, and try to find that sweet spot. Less crime, less incarceration. It's not always easy, but it's important.
Now, we've covered this ground, how to help Black boys and men, education, employment, and incarceration related policies. But I recall from your presentation a few years ago at the Boston Fed, what really struck me about it was your kind of rumination on how the political majority of the country needs to be persuaded of the importance of these imperatives, and how and again, correct me if I get this wrong, if progressives overplay their hand and don't take into account the legitimate concerns of the white working class who might resist some of their reform efforts, they engender backlash that can then kind of blow up in your face. I mean, in fact, you had the sentence on one of your slides like avoiding the backlash this time kind of thing. Talk about that, Harry, because I think it's really important in the contemporary post Black Lives Matter environment that we inhabit.
Well, you have accurately described my position on that. I think progressives sometimes are completely oblivious to the backlash that their comments generate. I mean, just a comment like defund the police ended up doing so much damage, I think, to Democrats, progressives themselves. You look at that George Floyd period. You look at what was going on in Minneapolis and Portland and Seattle. There was a lot of lawlessness. And we had a big spike in crime. Thankfully, it's starting to come down now. A big spike around the time of the pandemic. But I just think progressives on this can be oblivious to how they turn off other communities and the Democrats. And I'm a lifelong Democrat, so I don't mind being a little bit partisan on this. Democrats pushed away the white working class starting in the 60s and 70s. They pushed away all kinds of white ethnics, Irish, Italians. I fear that they are continuing to do it now. I fear that now they are doing it to Latinos. They are doing it to working class Blacks, and especially Black men. The numbers of folks right now most sympathetic to Trump seem to be working class Black and Latino men. So it's a tragedy to push those people into the right, where, to me, certain charlatan politicians, I don't have to mention their names, then take advantage of that situation. So I think it is trying to sensibly address their fears, to show that some of their fears, some of their concerns are valid. But that, if you really want to reduce crime, or if you want to have sensible immigration reform, there's a sensible way to do that doesn't swing to one extreme or the other. And I think we need to do more of that, because progressive politics have just driven away too many folks that could be the allies of people on the center left or on the left.
You mentioned William Julius Wilson before, and I think of him in this context. I think of class, not race, as the guiding principle here, which is not to say race doesn't matter but to say that if you're trying to get a policy enacted that's actually going to move the needle in the right direction, you need 50% plus one of the voters to get behind you. And you're best off framing your policy advocacy in class and not racial terms if that's your objective almost all the time.
I think, and I love Bill Wilson. I think, when he first started writing his first book, The Declining Significance of Race, was in the mid-'70s, and as time went on, his arguments became more nuanced. I think what Bill would say about that now is that race matters, class matters, the interaction of the two. And that's my view. I think that as you go down the class ladder, the barriers associated with being Black grow. There's a sort of pernicious interaction. So by the time you get to sort of low income Black boys, Black men in poor neighborhoods, they face so many barriers, so few opportunities. But yeah, you have to talk about class not in a way that drives away so many, and again, there are some folks who know how to do that. Tim Walz seems to be pretty good at it. Connor Lamb. There's a bunch of folks that have, on the Democratic side that get elected, in the Senate, people like John Tester and Sherrod Brown, who are not big lefties, but I'm not endorsing.
And they may not be long for this world either.
Well, we'll find out in November. But there are ways of doing this. I think, I don't expect Democrats to ever recapture a majority because the cultural and social gaps are too wide. And the other problem Democrats have, of course, politically, is that it's easier when your whole constituency is older white Christians. Democrats have to cobble together this very diverse constituencies, and that does mean sometimes doing some things that will turn out, say, young progressives of color. You might have to have a slightly different message for them than the older working class folks. But at least let's try to bridge some of those divides and not inflame them.
Okay. I can agree with that. And I can take this opportunity to thank you, Harry, for your time and for your wisdom. Harry Holzer, Lafarge Professor of Public Policy at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University, an economist and a longtime acquaintance of mine. I learned a lot from you, Harry. Thanks a lot.
As I have from you, Glenn, and thank you for having me on your show. It's been great.